The history of the tank began in World War I, when armored all-terrain fighting vehicles were first deployed as a response to the problems of trench warfare, ushering in a new era of mechanized warfare. Though initially crude and unreliable, tanks eventually became a mainstay of ground armies. By World War II, tank design had advanced significantly, and tanks were used in quantity in all land theaters of the war. The Cold War saw the rise of modern tank doctrine and the rise of the general-purpose main battle tank. The tank still provides the backbone to land combat operations in the 21st century. Development. World War I generated new demands for armored self-propelled weapons which could navigate any kind of terrain, and this led to the development of the tank. The great weakness of the tank's predecessor, the armored car, was that it required smooth terrain to move upon, and new developments were needed for cross-country capability. The tank was originally designed as a special weapon to solve an unusual tactical situation, the stalemate of the trenches on the Western Front. It was a weapon designed for one simple task: crossing the killing zone between trench lines and breaking into enemy. The armored tank was intended to be able to protect against bullets and shell splinters, and pass through barbed wire in a way infantry units could not hope to, thus allowing the stalemate to be broken. Few recognized during World War I that the means for returning mobility and shock action to combat was already present in a device destined to revolutionize warfare on the ground and in the air. This was the internal combustion engine, which had made possible the development of the tank and eventually would lead to the mechanized forces that were to assume the old roles of horse, cavalry and to loosen the grip of the machine gun on the battlefield. With increased firepower and protection, these mechanized forces would only some 20 years later become the armor of World War II, when self-propelled artillery, the armored personnel carrier, the wheeled cargo vehicle, and supporting aviation, all with adequate communications, were combined to constitute the modern armored division. Commanders regained the capability of maneuver. Numerous concepts of armored all-terrain vehicles had been imagined for a long time. With advent of trench warfare in World War I, the Allied French and British developments of the tank were largely parallel and coincided in time. Early concepts. In the 15th century, a Hussite called Jan Žižka won several battles using armored wagons containing cannon that could be fired through holes in the sides, but his invention was not used after his lifetime until the 20th century. In 1903, a French artillery captain named Levavasseur proposed the Levavasseur project, a cannon autopropulsor, moved by a caterpillar system and fully armored for protection, powered by an 80-horsepower petrol engine. The Levavasseur machine would have had a crew of 3, storage for ammunition, and a cross-country ability, but the viability of the project was disputed by the Artillery Technical Committee, until it was formally abandoned in 1908 when it was known that a Caterpillar tractor had been developed. The Hornsby of engineer David Roberts, H.G. Wells, in his short story The Land Ironclads, published in the Strand magazine in December 1903, had described the use of large, armored cross-country vehicles armed with cannon and machine guns, and equipped with pedrail wheels, to break through a system of fortified trenches, disrupting the defense and clearing the way for an infantry advance. They were essentially long, narrow and very strong steel frameworks carrying the engines, and borne upon 8 pairs of big pedrail wheels, each about 10 feet in diameter, each driving wheel and set upon long axles free to swivel round a common axis. This arrangement gave them the maximum of adaptability to the contours of the ground. They crawled level along the ground with 1 foot high upon a hillock and another deep in a depression, and they could hold themselves erect and steady sideways upon even a steep hillside. Quote, Some 8 years later, in 1911, two practical tank designs were developed independently by the Austrian engineering officer Gunther Bursten and Australian civil engineer Lancelot de Mol, but both were rejected by governmental administrations. American track tractors in Europe. Benjamin Holt of the Holt Manufacturing Company of Stockton, California was the first to patent a workable crawler-type tractor in 1907. The center of such innovation was in England, and in 1903 he traveled to England to learn more about ongoing development, though all those he saw failed their field tests. Holt paid Alvin Lombard $60,000 for the right to produce vehicles under Lombard's patent for the Lombard steam log hauler. Holt returned to Stockton and, utilizing his knowledge and his company's metallurgical capabilities, he became the first to design and manufacture practical continuous tracks for use in tractors. In England, David Roberts of Hornsby and Amp Sons, Grantham, obtained a patent for a design in July 1904. In the United States, Holt replaced the wheels on a 40-horsepower Holt steamer, No. 77, with a set of wooden tracks bolted to chains. On November 24, 1904, he successfully tested the updated machine plowing the soggy delta land of Roberts Island. When World War I broke out, with the problem of trench warfare and the difficulty of transporting supplies to the front, the pulling power of crawling-type tractors drew the attention of the military. Holt tractors were used to replace horses to haul artillery and other supplies. The Royal Army Service Corps also used them to haul long trains of freight wagons over the unimproved dirt tracks behind the front. Holt tractors were ultimately the inspiration for the development of the British and French tanks. By 1916, about 1,000 of Holt's Caterpillar tractors were used by the British in World War I. Holt Vice President Murray M. Baker said that these tractors weighed about 18,000 pounds and had 120 horsepower. By the end of the war, 10,000 Holt vehicles had been used in the Allied war effort. French development. The French Colonel Jean-Baptiste Estienne articulated the vision of a cross-country armored vehicle on 24 August 1914. Victory in this war will belong to the belligerent who was the first to put a cannon on a vehicle capable of moving on all kinds of terrain. Some privately owned Holt tractors were used by the French army soon after the beginning of World War I to pull heavy artillery pieces in difficult terrain, but the French did not purchase Holts in large numbers. It was the sight of them in use by the British that later inspired Estienne to have plans drawn up for an armoured body on Caterpillar tracks. In the meantime, several attempts were made to design vehicles that could overcome the German barbed wire and trenches. From 1914 to 1915, an early experiment was made with the Boiro machine, with the objective of flattening barbed wire defenses and riding over gaps in a battlefield. The machine was made of huge parallel tracks, formed by 4 times 3 meters metallic frames rotating around a triangular motorized center. This device proved too fragile and slow, as well as incapable of changing direction easily, and was abandoned. In France, on 1 December 1914, M. Frot, an engineer in canal construction at the Compagnie Nationale du Nord, proposed to the French ministry a design for a land ship with armor and armament based on the motorization of a compactor with heavy wheels or rollers. The Frot-Lafley was tested on 18 March 1915 and effectively destroyed barbed wire lines, but was deemed lacking in mobility. The project was abandoned in favor of General Estienne's development using a tractor base, codenamed Tractor Estienne. In 1915, attempts were also made to develop vehicles with powerful armor and armament, mounted on the cross-country chassis of agricultural tractors, with large dented wheels, such as the armoured Gabay Fortress. The vehicle was powered by electricity, and armed with a navy cannon of 37 mm, but it too proved impractical. In January 1915, the French arms manufacturer Schneider and Amp Co. sent out its chief designer, Eugene Brilliat, to investigate tractors from the American Holt Manufacturing Company, at the time participating in a test program in England for a project of mechanical wire-cutting machines. On his return, Brilliat, who had earlier been involved in designing armored cars for Spain, convinced the company management to initiate studies on the development of a tractor-blind army based on the Baby Holt chassis, two of which were ordered. Experiments on the Holt Caterpillar tracks started in May 1915 at the Schneider plant with the 75 HP wheel-directed model and the 45 HP integral Caterpillar Baby Holt, showing the superiority of the latter. On the 16th of June, new experiments followed in front of the President of the Republic, and on the 10th of September for Commander Ferris, the first complete chassis with armor was demonstrated at Sauen on the 9th of December 1915 to the French army, with the participation of Colonel Estienne. On the 12th of December, unaware of the Schneider experiments, Estienne presented to the High Command a plan to form an armored force, equipped with tracked vehicles. He was put in touch with Schneider, and in a letter dated the 31st of January 1916, Commander-in-Chief Joffre ordered the production of 400 tanks of the type designed by Brilliat and Estienne. Although the actual production order of 400 Schneider CA-1 was made a bit later, on the 25th of February 1916. Soon after, on the 8th of April 1916, another order for 400 Saint-Chamond tanks was also placed. Schneider had trouble with meeting production schedules, and the tank deliveries were spread over several months from the 8th of September 1916. The Saint-Chamond tank would start being delivered from the 27th of April, 1917. British development. The Lincolnshire firm Richard Hornsby and Amp Sons had been developing the Caterpillar tractor since 1902, and built an oil engine-powered crawler to move lifeboats up a beach in 1908. In 1909, the Northern Light and Power Company of Dawson City, Canada, owned by Joe Boyle, ordered a steam-powered Caterpillar tractor. It was delivered to the Yukon in 1912. Hornsby's tractors were trialed between 1905 and 1910 on several occasions with the British Army as artillery tractors, but not adopted. Hornsby sold its patents to Holt Tractor of California. In 1914, the British War Office ordered a Holt tractor and put it through trials at Aldershot. Although it was not as powerful as the 105 horsepower Foster Daimler tractor, the 75 horsepower Holt was better suited to haul heavy loads over uneven ground. Without a load, the Holt tractor managed a walking pace of 4 miles per hour. Towing a load, it could manage 2 miles per hour. Most importantly, Holt tractors were readily available in quantity. The War Office was suitably impressed and chose it as a gun tractor. In July 1914, Lt. Col. Ernest Swinton, a British Royal Engineer officer, learned about Holt tractors and their transportation capabilities in rough terrain from a friend who had seen one in Antwerp, but passed the information on to the Transport Department. When the First World War broke out, Swinton was sent to France as an Army war correspondent, and in October 1914 identified the need for what he described as a machine gun destroyer, a cross-country, armed vehicle. He remembered the Holt tractor, and decided that it could be the basis for an armored vehicle. Swinton proposed in a letter to Sir Maurice Hankey, Secretary of the Committee of Imperial Defence, that the British Committee of Imperial Defence build a power-driven, bulletproof, tracked vehicle that could destroy enemy guns. Hankey persuaded the lukewarm War Office to make a trial on the 17th of February 1915 with a Holt tractor, but the Caterpillar bogged down in the mud. The project was abandoned, and the War Office gave up investigations. In May 1915, the War Office made new tests on a trench-crossing machine, the Triton Trench Crosser. The machine was equipped with large tractor wheels 8 feet in diameter, and carried girders on an endless chain which were lowered above a trench so that the back wheels could roll over it. The machine would then drag the girder behind until on flat terrain, so that it could reverse over them and set them back in place in front of the vehicle. The machine proved much too cumbersome and was abandoned. Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, learned of the armoured tractor idea. He reignited an investigation of the idea of using the Holt tractor. The Royal Navy and the Landships Committee at last agreed to sponsor experiments and tests of armoured tractors as a type of land ship. In March, Churchill ordered the building of 18 experimental landships, 12 using diplock padrails, and 6 using large wheels. Construction, however, failed to move forward, as the wheels seemed impractical after a wooden mock-up was realized. The wheels were initially planned to be 40 feet in diameter, but turned out to be still too big and too fragile at 15 feet. The padrails also met with industrial problems, and the system was deemed too large, too complicated and underpowered. Instead of choosing to use the Holt tractor, the British government chose to involve a British agricultural machinery firm, Foster & Sons, whose managing director and designer was Sir William Triton. After all these projects failed by June 1915, ideas of grandiose landships were abandoned, and a decision was taken to make an attempt with U.S. bullet creeping grip Caterpillar tracks, by connecting 2 of them together to obtain an articulated chassis deemed necessary for maneuvering. Experiments failed in tests made in July 1915. Another experiment was conducted with an American kill-and-straight track tractor. A wire-cutting mechanism was successfully fitted, but the trench-crossing capability of the vehicle proved insufficient. A Delaunay Belleville armored car body was fitted, making the kill-and-straight machine the first armored tracked vehicle. But the project was abandoned as it turned out to be a blind alley, unable to fulfill all-terrain warfare requirements. After these experiments, the committee decided to build a smaller experimental landship, equivalent to 1/2 the articulated version, and using lengthened US-made bullet-creeping grip Caterpillar tracks. This new experimental machine was called the No. 1 Lincoln machine. Construction started on the 11th of August 1915, with the first trial starting on the 10th of September 1915. These trials failed, however, because of unsatisfactory tracks. Development continued with new, re-engineered tracks, and the machine, now renamed Little Willie, was completed in December 1915 and tested on the 3rd of December 1915. Trench crossing ability was deemed insufficient, however, and Walter Gordon Wilson developed a rhomboidal design, which became known as His Majesty's Landship Centipede and later Mother, the first of the Big Willie types of true tanks. After completion on the 29th of January 1916, very successful trials were made, and an order was placed by the War Office for 100 units to be used on the Western Front Deployment in France on 12 February 1916, and a second order for 50 additional units was placed in April 1916. France started studying Caterpillar continuous tracks from January 1915, and actual tests started in May 1915, 2 months earlier than the Little Willie experiments. At the Sauen experiment, France tested an armored track tank prototype the same month Little Willie was completed. Ultimately, however, the British were the first to put tanks on the battlefield at the Battle of the Somme in September 1916. The name tank was introduced in December 1915 as a security measure and has been adopted in many languages. William Triton stated that when the prototypes were under construction from August 1915, they were deliberately falsely described in order to conceal their true purpose. In the workshop, the paperwork described them as water carriers, supposedly for use on the Mesopotamian front. In conversation, the workers referred to them as water tanks, or simply tanks. Quote, "In October, the Land Ships Committee decided, for security purposes, to change its own name to something less descriptive. One of the members, Ernest Swinton, suggested tank, and the committee agreed. The name tank was used in official documents and common parlance from then on, and the Land Ships Committee was renamed the Tank Supply Committee. This is sometimes confused with the labeling of the first production tanks with a caption in Russian. It translated as, with care to Petrograd, probably again inspired by the workers at Foster's, some of whom believed the machines to be snowplows meant for Russia, and was introduced from May 15, 1916. The committee was happy to perpetuate this misconception since it might also mislead the Germans. The naval background of the tank's development also explains such nautical tank terms as hatch, hull, bow, and ports. The great secrecy surrounding tank development, coupled with the skepticism of infantry commanders, often meant that infantry at first had little training to cooperate with tanks. Russian development. Vasily Mendeleev, an engineer in a shipyard, worked privately on a design of a super-heavy tank from 1911 to 1915. It was a heavily armored 170-ton tracked vehicle armed with one 120mm naval gun. The design envisioned many innovations that became standard features of a modern battle tank. Protection of the vehicle was well thought out. The gun included automatic loading mechanism, pneumatic suspension allowed adjusting of clearance. Some critical systems were duplicated. Transportation by railroad was possible by a locomotive or with adapter wheels. However, the cost was almost as much as a submarine and it was never built. The Vezdekod was a small cross-country vehicle designed by aero-engineer Alexander Perokovshikov that ran on a single wide rubber track propelled by a 10-horsepower engine. Two small wheels either side were provided for steering, but while the vehicles could cross ground well, its steering was ineffectual. In post-revolution Russia, the Vezdekod was portrayed in propaganda as the first tank. The Tsar tank, also known as the Lebedenko tank after its designer, was a tricycle-design vehicle on 9 meters high front wheels. It was expected that such large wheels would be able to cross any obstacle, but the smaller rear wheel became stuck when tested in 1915. The designers were prepared to fit larger engines, but the project and the vehicle was abandoned. German development. The A7V was the only German tank of World War I. It was made in the year 1918. The A7V was produced in small numbers. Operational use in World War I. A first offensive using Mark I tanks took place on 15 September 1916, during the Battle of the Somme, under Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig. 49 were committed, of which 32 were mechanically fit to take part in the advance and achieved some small, local successes. In July 1917, 216 British tanks were employed in the Third Battle of Ypres but found it almost impossible to operate in the muddy conditions and achieved little. Not until the 20th of November 1917, at Cambrai, did the British Tank Corps get the conditions it needed for success. Over 400 tanks penetrated almost 6 miles on a 7-mile wide front. However, success was not complete because the infantry failed to exploit and secure the tanks' gains, and almost all the territory gained was recaptured by the Germans. The British scored a far more significant victory the following year, on the 8th of August 1918, with 600 tanks in the Battle of Amiens. General Erich Ludendorff referred to that date as the Black Day of the German Army. Parallel to the British development, France designed its own tanks. The first two, the medium Schneider-Sierre and heavy Saint-Chamond, were not well conceived. Though produced in large numbers and showing technical innovations, the latter using an electromechanical transmission and a long 75mm gun. Both types saw action on numerous occasions but suffered consistently high losses. In 1918, the Renault FD light tank was the first tank in history with a modern configuration, a revolving turret on top and an engine compartment at the rear. It would be the most numerous tank of the war. A last development was the Super Heavy Char-2C, the largest tank ever to see service, be it some years after the armistice. The German response to the Cambrai assault was to develop its own armored program. Soon the massive A7V appeared. The A7V was a clumsy monster, weighing 30 tons and with a crew of 18. By the end of the war, only 20 had been built. Although other tanks were on the drawing board, material shortages limited the German Tank Corps to these A7 Versus and about 36 captured Mark IVs. The A7V would be involved in the first tank versus tank battle of the war on April 24, 1918 at the Second Battle of Villers-Bretonneux, a battle in which there was no clear winner. Numerous mechanical failures and the inability of the British and French to mount any sustained drives in the early tank actions cast doubt on their usefulness, and by 1918, tanks were extremely vulnerable unless accompanied by infantry and ground attack aircraft, both of which worked to locate and suppress anti-tank defenses. But John J. Pershing, Commander-in-Chief, American Expeditionary Forces, requested in September 1917 that 600 heavy and 1,200 light tanks be produced in the United States. When General Pershing assumed command of the American Expeditionary Force and went to France, he took Lt. Colonel George Patton. Patton became interested in tanks. They were then unwieldy, unreliable, and unproved instruments of warfare, and there was much doubt whether they had any function and value at all on the battlefield. Against the advice of most of his friends, Patton chose to go into the newly formed U.S. Tank Corps. He was the first officer so assigned. The first American-produced heavy tank was the 43.5-TON Mark 8, a U.S.-British development of the successful British heavy tank design, intended to equip the Allied forces. Armed with 2 6-pounder cannons and 5 rifle-caliber machine guns, it was operated by an 11-man crew, and had a maximum speed of 6.5 miles per hour and a range of 50 miles. Because of production difficulties, only test vehicles were completed before the war ended. The American-built 6.5-TON M1917 light tank was a close copy of the French Renault FD. It had a maximum speed of 5.5 miles per hour and could travel 30 miles on its 30-gallon fuel fuel capacity. Again, because of production delays, none were completed in time to see action. In the summer of 1918, a 3-ton, 2-man tank, originated by the Ford Motor Company, was designed. It was powered by 2 Ford Model T 4-cylinder engines, armed with a 30-inch machine gun, and had a maximum speed of 8 miles per hour. It was considered unsatisfactory as a fighting vehicle, but to have possible value in other battlefield roles. An order was placed for 15,000, but only 15 were completed, and none saw service in the war. American tank units first entered combat on the 12th of September 1918 against the St. Mihiel salient with the 1st Army. They belonged to the 344th and 345th Light Tank Battalions, elements of the 304th Tank Brigade, commanded by Lt. Colonel Patton, under whom they had trained at the Tank Centre in Bourg, France, and were equipped with the Renault FD, supplied by France. Although mud, lack of fuel, and mechanical failure caused many tanks to stall in the German trenches, the attack succeeded and much valuable experience was gained. By the armistice of the 11th of November 1918, the VIAF was critically short of tanks, as no American-made ones were completed in time for use in combat.